All right. What is up, folks? Welcome back to another episode of the Help Me Understand podcast. Per the usual, I'm your host, Coach JK McLeod, and we are kicking off a fitness-focused episode of Help Me Understand. Today, we're going to be talking about what I would recommend if you are caught in the middle between wanting to get really jacked, build more muscle, and also have an athletic performance-based goal. You want to stay really functional, really fluid, be able to perform like an athlete in good condition, and also build muscle, maintain muscle, get really jacked. How to handle that. And I'll give you some context on where that came from very shortly here. However, before going any further, I, as always, want to say thank you for choosing to press play on the Help Me Understand podcast. I know that you have plenty of other podcast content that you can and most likely do consume. So I truly never take it for granted that you chose to press play on Help Me Understand. So let's go ahead and dig into today's topic. And for some context, this was a recent post that I read on Threads that inspired today's topic. So in this post, the person said, stuck between wanting just to be huge and wanting to be functional. I know they can coexist to a point, but why do I fear I'll lose the muscle I've worked so hard to gain, or at least a certain aesthetic? I just know as soon as I start running heavy, that booty is gone. And I thoroughly enjoyed reading that particular post. It was kind of funny. And also, it came at a great time because I wasn't completely sold on what I was going to use for a topic with today's episode. I'm picking this particular one because it's transparently relatable for myself. And also, this is something that I think directly addresses what I call the messy middle sometimes. And what I will refer to sometimes as the messy middle includes that individual who doesn't specifically have a weight loss or a fat loss goal, doesn't specifically have a burning concern or problem or crisis health-wise that they're needing to deal with at this particular time. They want to build and or maintain muscle because they understand the importance of having muscle, and also they just like being muscular, and they also have an interest in maintaining a certain level of conditioning and periodically enjoy jumping into things like a Spartan race or a DECA or even High Rocks. I know is something that's taking off, it seems like, within the past, I'd say about a year or so. Folks that really enjoy the feeling of things like CrossFit, Orange Theory, F45, different boot camp style things, and also really like doing things that are focused on hypertrophy, bodybuilding, maybe even some powerlifting. And I say that I can relate to this because I am very slowly going back to that particular sort of mindset. When I first really took ownership over my own fitness and health, I started primarily with bodybuilding because that's what I won't say knew at the time. Actually, no, I will. That's what I knew at the time. That's the thing that I could easily access because that's what was on the front page of all of the magazines at that time that were geared towards men. So this was back in around 2009, 2010-ish. So most of the men's magazines that were easily accessible to me at Borders and Barnes and Noble, flashback or throwback to Borders, most of the things that were front and center dealt with men being huge and jacked. And then the content that was geared towards women were things that were all about being slim and lean and very cardio based. So when I first got into really taking control and ownership over my fitness, it was all about lifting weights. And then as I became more aware of other modalities, specifically CrossFit, then I integrated that into what I was already doing with lifting weights. and became what I called a cross builder. So it's that person was doing CrossFit and bodybuilding at the same time. And I think I've mentioned this before. If I had to estimate, I would say that at the most, the biggest mix was probably 60% bodybuilding and 40% CrossFit. So then fast forward a few years later, then functional bodybuilding comes along, which was really, I'd say, brought to the forefront by Marcus Filly. And then he pulled that really from a lot of the training that he got from his coach, James Fitzgerald, excuse me, with OPEX. I'm getting a little off track, so I'll bring it back to the road here in just a moment. However, that's where most of my background, how that trajectory really started. I started with bodybuilding, then was introduced to CrossFit, morphed the two into a format that I thought worked for me, then found functional bodybuilding, which was like, oh, snap. So this thing that I've been putting together on my own, there is actually some modality and some structure around that. So learned what I could about that. And then now that definitely informs generally the style that I have these days with programming workouts. I program a few different types of tracks and also am extremely comfortable in going down one path or the other path or a mix of both. And that's what we'll get into today. So there was a point for sure where I had very, very similar goals to what that person was talking about in the post, with trying to find what I'll call that harmony. Most folks are going to call it balance. I call it harmony because sometimes the backup singers are going to need to kind of come to the forefront. The lead singer maybe takes a little bit of a break because they got a costume change and all those good analogies. So a harmony between wanting to get really jacked and also wanting to be athletic and be able to perform, especially in events, OCRs. I did a handful of Spartan races. I've done one Tough Mudder, and I am potentially looking at morphing that whole style back together again. So what I thought would be helpful, potentially, especially as we are approaching, for many of us, getting into the warmer months, times where people are going to be outside more and there are going to be more events, not just high rocks. There'll be more events like Spartan races and Decas and everything in between, Tough Mudders. There's always, it seems like everywhere has some form of like not a fun run, but some sort of obstacle based thing that you can get into. And also now more than ever before, there's an increased awareness of the importance of strength and muscle from not just the aesthetic standpoint, not just the longevity standpoint and the quality of life standpoint, also just aesthetically. I think that generally muscle, whether male or female, is talked about more than it ever has been before. So I want to spend some time sharing with you how I would walk someone through some advice. And I jotted down a bunch of different bullet points that I'll go over with you here on how to really find a harmony between wanting to get really jacked and also wanting to be able to perform like an athlete and maintain a level of conditioning. So let's put it that way, the athletic bodybuilder. So let's see. I tried to put these in somewhat of an order. So the first thing that I would say is start with being honest about what your goal actually is. And something that I've talked about before is folks having what I call competing goals or competing priorities. And I did not originate that particular phrase. I want to say that my friend Coach Ashley D is one of the first people that I heard talk about it, and she said that she heard it from somebody else. So this is not like new by any means. However, the phrase having competing priorities, I think, is definitely helpful to understand here. So it's something that I've talked about in the past. Most of the time when I've talked about it, it's when folks are wanting to train for a very intense event. Most common example being, I'm training to run a marathon and I also have a very aggressive fat loss goal. And I will let folks know that from my point of view, those are two competing priorities, because one thing, the marathon, the training protocol for that is best done or best executed when you're well fed, and definitely not when you're at a deficit. Your other goal of an aggressive fat loss phase, aggressive weight loss, aggressive fat loss, whichever umbrella you want to put it in. And I say aggressive being a short time frame, say a 6-week or less time frame, 8-week or less time frame, depending on how deep your deficit is. That's the thing. You want to be in a caloric deficit. So one is a goal that is asking you to make sure you are at least at maintenance, if not more, from a caloric standpoint, an energy standpoint. The other one is asking you to be underneath the maintenance for your energy. So that's what I commonly am talking about when it is competing priorities. In this particular case, I wouldn't say that these are competing priorities. I would say it would be more about managing those priorities. So they're priorities where you've got to manage and find just the right harmony between the two. So a question that I want you to ask yourself is, which one of those matters the most right now? And something that I think that will be helpful, and I'll talk about this a bit later, is the athletic based goal. And I say this as somebody who's biased towards really enjoying lifting weights. So we're going to make the assumption that you are someone who does enjoy lifting weights and doesn't, more often than not, doesn't find yourself having to talk yourself into going to lift weights. Okay, so that's a massive disclaimer here. So ask yourself which one matters the most, and then put yourself on the hook for the athletic based goal, the performance based goal, the conditioning based goal. So scheduling, looking on a website, like I was just recently looking at a couple of websites to see about particular events that might be coming up sometime this year. A couple of years ago, I was potentially looking at doing a trail run, like putting that performance, so that conditioning based goal. I should say that, because if you were, you could be somebody who's getting ready for powerlifting, and that would be performance based also. So putting that conditioning based goal on your radar, putting something on your calendar, I think will definitely help as far as getting an understanding for which one is going to matter and when. Also, something else I jotted down, you won't be training 100% towards both at the exact same time. There's always going to be some sort of a trade-off, some sort of a sacrifice that's happening. So trying to max both of those things is usually going to lead to spinning your wheels. And I know that right now, or in my world, hybrid training is all the rage, especially because of the growth of HYROX. Like, that cannot be understated these days. As of the time that this podcast is being recorded and released, it is in April of 2026. In HYROX, I'm not going to say it's having its moment. I think that it's very close to having its moment. I think that if they continue to handle the marketing and engagement the way that they have, I could see within, I would say by 2028, it is like the thing that everybody is talking about and everybody's trying to do. From my understanding, as someone who hasn't done one, I was going to say yet, I'm also not really planning to do one. However, from what I've been able to understand from talking to friends and colleagues who have done them and who also coach very high level people to get ready for them, you have to you have to run. You have to nail the running. You have to understand and train for the running. Like, just thinking that this is like a casual athletic event that happens to have some running, to a person, they have all said absolutely not. It is a running event that has other events put into it. And they said probably the number one thing that people underestimate is how much running there actually is, especially what we call compromised running. And I'll talk about that most likely a little bit later. So let me stay on track here. So again, trying to max out with both building muscle and conditioning at the same time, it's an easy way to just be spinning your wheels on this. So strong recommendation here is periodize what your focus is actually going to be. So spend certain blocks of time where building strength and muscle is your priority, and then spend certain blocks of time where performance and conditioning is the overall priority. So while one thing is the priority, the other goal gets maintained, not pushed to the same sort of frequency level. So in that's one of the main reasons why I say when it comes to the thing that's going to be the performance conditioning focused thing, put that on the calendar. So say for instance it's April of 2026 right now. I would look at something and I would look at something that's at least 6 weeks out. Preferably I'd say in the 8 or more category, because a couple of months is to me a pretty solid training cycle. Take a look and it'd be okay, it's April right now. I'm looking at an event potentially in July. So I would put that event in July or August, whenever it may be, and then formulate a plan for, okay, I will maintain a particular level of conditioning up until about, let's say, 8 weeks prior to that event. And then 8 weeks before that event, the conditioning and performance goal becomes the priority. Other than that, I'm primarily prioritizing building strength and muscle and maintaining a level of conditioning. And then when the performance and conditioning focus becomes the priority, I'm just looking to maintain muscle while I'm getting ready for that event. Hopefully that makes some sense. So let me define what maintenance actually means, or let me encourage you also that for you, I want you to define what maintenance actually means, whether you're going to be in the maintenance period for your strength and muscle while you're focusing on prioritizing performance and conditioning, or vice versa. So, what maintenance will likely mean is that you are not doing as much volume as you would if something was the priority. You are still training with a good fair level of intensity, just likely not as much volume and not as much frequency. So you want to still be able, for the most part, to hit somewhere around, I'd say anywhere from about 70, maybe 80% of what your 1 rep maxes are for some of your bigger lifts. You're not finding that your weights are way off from where you primarily lift. However, you're not specifically focused on trying to set PRs or anything like that. That's if your muscle building and your strength building is in its maintenance period. From a conditioning standpoint, basically the same sort of mentality. You wouldn't have as many runs or as many biking or as many rowing sessions. You are doing enough to maintain a certain level of conditioning. Something that one of my clients does, who likes to maintain their conditioning the majority of the year, is we have a timed 1 mile run that's done a few times a month. For other folks, it can be something a little bit longer. It can be, I just heard from somebody recently that they do a 5K every month, every 3 to 4 weeks, I think that they said, in order to maintain their conditioning. And that's they have a general time range that they typically try to finish within. And that helps them understand that they're still in maintenance. So I do think that that's something that can be and is really helpful, is as you are going through those different periodized blocks of prioritizing either muscling strength or performance and conditioning, you identify for yourself what is maintenance. Same way as when you're going throughout, hopefully the majority of the year, where you're not specifically trying to lose weight, you're in maintenance, then you have, more often than not, I certainly have a weight range. Like, I generally, when I'm within maintenance, I'm ranging in this particular around, let's say 5, maybe 7-ish pound swing when I'm in maintenance. So you're training exactly the same way. All right. Next point, training structure definitely matters here. So recommend that you have some days where it's primarily focused on strength and muscle building. You're being very intentional with your lifting. You are always really focused on a good amount of progressive overload happening. So progressive overload is where you're able to either lift more weight, so you can go heavier, or you can do more reps, or you're finding yourself performing the movement better overall. So you're potentially getting better results because you're putting more tension on that muscle, because you're performing the movement with better technique, all those different things. So when it comes to your training structure, making sure that you protect those strength and muscle building days. Then when it comes to the days or sessions where you may be doing your conditioning, still be purposeful with it. You're not just looking for just random, yeah, I hopped on the bike for about 10 minutes sort of a thing. You're still being strategic and specific with those sessions, regardless of whether or not you are in a particular training phase or not. So, an example for me right now, I would say that my priority right now is on the muscle building, and then the strength and muscle building, and then I'm maintaining a certain level of conditioning. So when I do my high intensity work that I do about once a week, I spend about, let's say, 10 to 15 minutes doing some interval work that's high intensity. I'm still being purposeful about the fact that I want to hit a particular heart rate range through a certain level of intensity during those conditioning sessions, even though that conditioning is not my priority right now because I'm not specifically getting ready for an event. So still be specific about what your training structure is and what you're doing. Something that I had jotted this down, and then I do vacillate a little back and forth. I had jotted down that you may want to avoid stacking like everything into the same session. Uh, However, I do also understand that, my lens forever and hopefully always will be lifestyle centric, which is understanding that you have an X amount of time that you're going to legitimately be able to dedicate to your training because you have a life outside of training, and your training shouldn't detract from the things that really matter to you the most. Yes, I understand trade-offs. I 100% plus understand sacrifices also. And there needs to be, from my standpoint, in order to stay consistent, there needs to be an understanding of, okay, there are going to be some days where you do your strength and you do your conditioning, or vice versa. So I'll get into that with a couple of recommendations a little bit better. So although if at all possible, I would say try not to stack everything into the same session. I understand that there are going to be times where that's the thing. Generally, what I recommend, if the conditioning is the main priority, then you do your conditioning, get that squared away, and then you potentially are doing some pump work just to finish out. If the strength and the muscle building is the main priority, then I say you're doing the majority of that. You're doing that during the majority of your workout. Say if it's a 1 hour workout, then your lifting is probably, let's say about 40-ish minutes, 40 to 50 minutes. And then you're doing some sort of short like finisher, whether it be something that's more of a steady state or it's something that's a higher intensity piece just to finish out. All right, a few other things here. This gets back into making sure that there is an alignment with what you're focused on. So your nutrition definitely needs to match the phase that you're in, the priority that you have. So if you are in a phase where you're specifically looking to build muscle and maintain as much muscle as possible, you may be looking at a slight surplus, which for the most part starts with ensuring that you're consuming enough protein. I'll be straight up with you though. I also have jotted down a note that I think that protein is the main thing to pretty much watch. I am not one of those zealots who's like everybody needs to be eating 7,000 grams of protein per day. I think that just generally somewhere in the 0.5 to 0.8 grams per pound of desired body weight is, for the most part, going to be sufficient for most folks. Does that mean that anything over that is too much? No, it doesn't. So if you just translated that, I'm going to bring you back to Google Translate and ask you to listen to what I just mentioned again here. So 0.5 to 0.8, I think is sufficient for the majority of folks. And then if you happen to enjoy more than that, especially if it helps you stay fuller longer, then all good, have at it. It's all good. So muscle building phase, again, you're ideally going to be in a slight surplus with a prioritization on protein. If you're in a performance phase, you're going to be closer to your maintenance, and then really, really super dialed in on making sure that you are planning your nutrition around fueling your sessions for sure. And then really what it boils down to is under eating is going to kill both of the goals. So whether your goal is getting ready for something that's conditioning based, or your goal is building and maintaining enough muscle, under eating typically is a pretty good way to work your way out of the effectiveness of either one of those things. So just keep that in mind. I think something that can be really helpful too and why I'm such a fan of maintenance is that with maintenance, you typically have more autonomy and more encouragement to not have to do the same thing every day after day after day. So it's like if there's a particular day where you've got particular events that you really want to indulge a bit more. And when I say indulge, I'm not talking like guilty indulgence because I'm not really a big supporter of that sort of a language. I'm just saying like you're going somewhere and there's going to be like a fat pizza and fat with a PH pizza, then go all out, like enjoy that particular pizza. That's something that you plan to do and you really enjoy. Then if there's another day where it's like, I got all this stuff around me, but it's not really anything that I'm super into. Okay. Like you don't have to force yourself in order to hit specific numbers or anything along those lines. I think that maintenance is about where things lie in the overall averages. So looking at just generally, okay, where are things at week over week? And it's not this day by day. Oh, I got to make sure I hit this. Oh, I went too far this day, so I got to bring it back and all that stuff. All right, jotted down also protein, again, is the non-negotiable here. From a scientific standpoint, it does help you continue to maintain a good amount of muscle, especially while you're really pushing your conditioning, making sure that you do still maintain an adequate amount of protein. I know this is something that really protein, and even I think, just slipped into this. We talk about protein quite a bit, really in terms of a lot of times in terms of like, well, in order to build muscle, you gotta do that. I'm now just talking about it just from a day-to-day standpoint, just the importance of ensuring that that's there. And in the back of my head, I just have this voice. It's like, dude, people are getting beat over the head and both ears all the time with the importance of protein. Nobody needs to say it. However, I'm not going to let that opportunity slip by. So just making sure that you do have that as a non-negotiable definitely helps from a recovery standpoint, again, across both goals. And then from my point of view, carbohydrates are really the macronutrient that you can have the most flexibility around, especially when it comes to getting an understanding of what amount really helps you fuel and recover from your workouts, gauging your carbohydrate intake there. All right, just got a few more here. Sleep. This one is always the great multiplier. So poor sleep is typically going to equal poor recovery and poor decision making. And then in terms of that, then neither goal really makes any sort of progress. So I'll talk about this again in a minute as part of the recovery piece and a bit of a different take that I have on that. However, poor sleep definitely won't help from a recovery standpoint and from a decision-making standpoint. And this is something that I've talked about in previous episodes quite a bit. I think that sleep and nutrition, they're very neck and neck when it comes to which one is the most important thing. And definitely open to hearing your feedback and your experiences with this. I remember bringing this up to some of my friends that were coaches, like in a group chat setting, and just asking, okay, out of these three things, nutrition, sleep, and exercise, which is the one that if you don't get it right, you're making it more difficult on yourself. So out of the three things, nutrition, sleep, and exercise, which one can you just not get wrong? And of course, everybody was like, well, it's between this and this. And I'm like, no, I'm asking, you have those three things. Which one can you not get wrong? And it was split pretty much dead down the middle with eating and sleeping, because for many of us, and I'm included, when I have not gotten enough sleep for me, then I can definitely tell where that starts to become an issue in food choices, in overall decision making, like my irritability. It's a bit different. Just all sorts of things are just a little bit funky if I haven't had enough sleep for me. And I stress for me because everybody's different. Then there's other folks that are just like, I don't know, like I can go through a decent amount of like bad sleep, or, my sleep has been off because of kids or whatever, work schedule is going on. But if my eating isn't on point, then I just get really irritable. I get hangry. So basically the same sort of reactions, the same sort of symptoms, just different problems at the base of it. So be interested to hear what you think about that. Something else that I jotted down is recovery. And recovery, I think, is kind of an interesting one. I've been thinking a lot recently about the fact that we often talk about recovery in the same breath as we do about our sleep. So we'll talk about your training, your nutrition, your sleep, and recovery. So that's a very common phrase, sleep and recovery. And I recently am on this mission to shift recovery strategy actually being part of your training plan. Recent episode that I did where I talked about really reframing your rest days as recharge days. So thinking about those recharge days, which really same thing as a recovery day potentially. But what I do is instead of just calling it a rest day, it's a recharge day so that you can be ready for the next training session that's going to come. And then very similar kind of thinking about reframing like the recovery strategy is recovery. We primarily are thinking about, okay, recovery in terms of sleep and days off. And those are certainly a piece of it. I think that just the same as we're planning our training days, I'm working on I am working on creating a more consistent habit of also talking about recovery in the same breath that I'm talking about training. So, okay, what's your training plan going to look like? Very commonly we'll say, how many days are you going to train? And then what I'm working on is then in the same breath, how many days are you going to train? And then which days will you be recovering? So just working on that, because your ability to be able to adapt and recover from your training is going to be extremely helpful in the process. And if you're walking around unrecovered, always feeling like you're cooked, you won't be really adapting to the actual training that you're going through, whether it's the conditioning based training or it's the muscle building training. So just overall, watch your weekly fatigue too. I jotted that one down. And when I'm talking about weekly fatigue, your fatigue is not just coming from your workouts. So as a coach who is very lifestyle centric, you want to take into account your job stress, your just overall movement that you've had, your steps, your life load, all of that stuff absolutely counts. So you would really be focused on making sure that you are adjusting your training, which includes your recovery, based on the full picture, especially when you have a good understanding of what your non-training commitments are. Like the mental load that you undergo, depending on what things look like in and outside of your work, in and outside of your family responsibilities, and especially when I say family responsibilities, at this point, a good amount of my audience is we're approaching or beyond middle age. And some of us may also be helping as I'm not at this point yet. However, I have plenty of folks that I know who are very, very involved in care for their parents and grandparents and things like that. So that's something to consider also. I think just again, I'm in that age bracket where it's no longer when we talk about like caretaking, we're not specifically talking about children, because for many of us, our children are grown and hopefully like decently capable of doing certain things on their own. And also then we may be contributing to doing certain things for parents, like taking them to appointments, or maybe they live with you or things like that. So that's also something to take into account as far as your non-training commitments. So just in closing things out, just remember that it is, whether you can have both of those goals, it is important to understand that it's about finding some sort of a harmony between those particular goals. And again, I use that analogy of harmony in the band or the singer, because there are times where one singer is going to have the loudest part, and then there's other times where you really need like the background to kind of come to the forefront and take over and really set the mood. So it's just an understanding of where those ebbs and flows need to happen. I do definitely recommend that you zoom out at times and really track the trends, see where things are. When you're in your strength phase and your muscle building phase and your muscle maintenance phase, whatever it may be, make sure that you're tracking your progress, track your workouts, How are you doing with those particular lifts? So making sure that you're paying attention to that. Then also, when you're in your conditioning, in your performance phase, assuming that you've got something on your calendar. I think, again, that's one of the easiest ways to really stay on point with this is put something on your calendar, whether it's something like, again, like a Spartan race. Those are the ones that just come to mind because I've done them in the past. A 5K, maybe a half marathon, maybe you're doing one of the Spartan Decas, like whatever it might be, a High Rocks, just those, I think, a bit easier to track what the progress is because you have an understanding of what you're going to be facing. So if you are getting ready to train for if you're training for a half marathon, you know the importance of understanding your splits and different things like that. Even if you're training for a CrossFit event, for some of the not actual CrossFit regionals. What I'm talking about is there's different areas that will still hold like local competitions and Festivus. I don't know if that's still a thing, just things like that. You also, while you may not know the exact workout, or actually I think a lot of those do tell you the exact workouts. So you can even get an understanding of where you are from a skill standpoint, from a time standpoint, and all that other stuff. So just understanding that, just zoom out and really track those things so that you can have a good understanding of where you are. So in closing here, really want to encourage anyone who has multiple goals just to take time to prioritize which one is going to be at the forefront and then maintain the other one at that same time. So the thing that I think about is almost like when you are driving, you're driving and you're focused on your main focus is what's happening potentially like directly in front of you. And also you're paying attention to the peripheral. Like I was going to say, you can't not focus on what's going on around you. I guess you can, but that probably doesn't work out for you very well. So you're at your best when not only are you focused on the lane that you're in, but you are paying attention to what's happening in the peripheral. So this would be one of those rare times where it's not about like putting blinders on and not paying attention to what's happening. You just know that your priority, your most immediate concern is what's happening directly in front of you, while also paying attention to what's happening in the left and the right lanes so that you can continue to maintain your safety. So pick a direction, give it a season, and then keep that particular other one going and maintain. You don't have to completely neglect it. All right. I hope this has been somewhat helpful. Definitely open to your feedback on this particular episode. And if you have ideas, questions, topics, whatever it might be for future fitness focused episodes of Help Me Understand, then reach out. You can always hit me up on Instagram at Coach JK McLeod. That's MCLEOD. You can also email me, jk@jkmcleod.com. And then last but certainly not least, going to throw in a plug for another podcast that I'm on. I'm co-host with my friend Kelly Lutz, and that podcast is called Lifting, Running, and Living with Kelly and JK. We are, I think, 75 episodes, something like that, deep at this point. So if you're interested in hearing our takes on all things lifting, running, and living, lots of living talk for sure. But we also do talk about things that are going on in the world of just fitness in general. She's the runner. I am not, as you will quickly pick up on. So give that one a listen to. All right. Thanks again. Appreciate you tuning in to another episode of the Help Me Understand podcast. Take care of yourself, and I'll see you next time. Bye now.